Why does the West always interfere in African issues? Why can't they mind their business? Is it that they are done solving the numerous challenges in their countries? It is honestly baffling, but for some reason, the West thinks that they know better than African leaders and know what is good for Africa. This is why they have always interfered in Africa. In a viral video, the military commander of the US AFRICOM, a US military organization in Africa, has accused President Traore of Burkina Faso of using Burkina Faso's gold to protect himself and his position. The US commander made this accusation during a reading at the Congress after Niger sent them packing from the country. The question is, why is the US military so concerned with what Traore is doing in Burkina Faso? Why can't the US military mind its business?
I can imagine a situation, though, in which the ruling elite of a country is receiving gratuities on the side that in order to the benefit of the strongman leader and not to the populace of the country. Does that sort of corruption and bribery go on with regard to the Belt and Road?
Absolutely, Chairman. I see this, and I don't mind calling them out, but Captain Traore and Burkina Faso, as they know that both, whether it's their gold reserves, that is all those proceeds are just in exchange to protect the junta regime.
Did you just hear the condescending tone used by this US commander? We have always talked about how the West sees itself as superior to African countries. African leaders like Kenyan President Ruto have noted how Western leaders treat them poorly and regard them as inferior. The issue of the West feeling superior to Africans is the reason why they colonized Africa with the aim of supposedly showing Africans the so-called civilized life. It is the reason why, after colonialism ended, they have continued to interfere and meddle in African affairs. And now they have turned their attention to President Traore of Burkina Faso. As you heard in the video, the US military commander of AFRICOM, Michael Langley, has accused President Traore of using the country's abundant gold resources for his personal protection. According to Langley, Traore is not using the gold for the people of Burkina Faso, but for himself. He is selling Burkina Faso's gold to provide protection for himself and ensure that he remains in power. But for anyone who has been following Traore since he came into power, you would know that this statement made by the US military commander is utter nonsense. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, someone who has not been following President Traore and heard this man's statement would easily believe him. But do you think that the US military commander is saying it from the goodness of his heart and because he cares for the people of Burkina Faso? Absolutely not. You see, this man has an ulterior motive. To understand, let's give a little background story. The US AFRICOM was established by President Bush in 2007 in line with the US policy for military expansion. In his own words, in Africa, promise and opportunity sit side by side with disease, war, and desperate poverty. This threatens both a core value of the United States, preserving human dignity, and our strategic priority, combating global terror. Can you imagine the condescending statement? So, in the goodness of their heart, the Bush administration identified Africa as a high priority and recognized that American security depends on partnering with Africans to strengthen fragile and failing states and to bring so-called ungoverned areas under the control of effective democracies. While a lot of African states resisted the establishment of such an organization in their lands, the US found a way to persuade some through threats and some with bribes, and that was how the US AFRICOM was established. Under AFRICOM, the US military bases in Africa expanded significantly. The number increased in just a few short hearts to more than 27 military bases in the continent. Reports reveal that the bases might even be more given the fact that the US military is very secretive about its operations in the continent. Now, if you ask any official of the US AFRICOM about their purpose in the continent, they would tell you to enhance security in African countries and combat terrorism. But it's been 18 years since this military organization was created, with access to the beta military equipment and intelligence network in the world. Yet the insecurity in Africa still persists. In fact, not only has it persisted, it has grown significantly, with terrorists becoming bolder by the day. From the Sahel region to Sudan, the DRC and the CAR, terrorism lurks at every corner. Yet the only changes that have occurred throughout all these years is an increase in the number of military bases and an increase in terrorism. What then is the need of the US military presence in Africa? For years, those weak and greedy African leaders have never thought to ask these questions or demanded answers, or even if they did, threats and bribes have kept their mouth shut forever. But then, the coups occurred in the Sahel and new military leaders arose. These leaders were not afraid to ask questions, and neither were they scared of threats. These leaders began to question the presence of foreign military forces which were supposed to fight insecurity. They questioned the necessity of their presence if their presence did nothing to combat the insecurity. And when they found no reasonable answers, President Traore of Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta of Mali, and General Tiani of Niger kicked them out. If you can recall the events that happened leading up to the expulsion of the US forces from Niger, you would know that it was the same superiority complex and condescending attitude displayed by the officials of the US military that got the military leaders of Niger angry. You see, after the coup and Niger had kicked out French forces, the US military decided to send some US officials to Niger to discuss the way forward. At the time, the US military base in Niger, which was the most expensive in the world, had suspended its operations as a result of the coup. Right from the time the coup occurred, the US had made it clear that they had no intention of leaving Niger because of the massive base they had established there. According to the US, it intended to do everything to ensure it remained in Niger. This was why the US was reluctant to call the coup a coup in Niger, because it would mean that they would have to suspend operations and impose sanctions. They didn't want to impose sanctions because they had not yet spoken to the military leaders of Niger and struck a deal with them. For those of you not aware, the US might say that it condemns military coups, but that's a lie. History has revealed over and over again how the US has not just not supported military regimes, but even funded and orchestrated it. The US have orchestrated coups in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world. They support military and corrupt revenue as long as these regimes follow their dictates. It doesn't matter whether the leaders of these countries kill and abuse their citizens. The US, supposedly champions of democracy, continue to support these regimes as long as they follow their dictates. So it was the same thing that the US planned to do in Niger. They organized a meeting with the Prime Minister of Niger and sent Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Molly Fee and included General Michael Langley, commander of the US Africa Command, to represent the US. Now, during the meeting, the US officials did what any US official would do. They began to act superior and started to dictate the terms of the agreement. They told the Niger operatives that for military cooperation to continue between Niger and the US, Niger would have to quickly return to civilian rule. In addition to this, Niger would have to change its choice of bilateral partners and stop building relations with non-Western partners like Russia and Iran. We are pretty sure that the US officials expected the military leaders of Niger to cower and heed to their demands, given the fact that it's the same tactics they have used all over the world. They probably thought that the military leader of Niger would agree because it would mean that his government has the backing of the US. However, after they ended the meeting and the representative of Niger reported the outcome of the meeting to General Tiani, Niger immediately made a shocking announcement that changed the geopolitics order in the Sahel. They ended military cooperation with the US and told them to pack their bags and leave the country. According to the military leader of Niger, Niger does not appreciate their condescending tone and imperialist attitude. In addition, Niger made it clear that the US did not have any right to dictate what Niger should or should not do. It was as simple as that. It was after this announcement was made to the world that the US Congress arranged a meeting with the US military to demand to know what was going on. It was at this meeting that the US commander made that ridiculous statement about President Traore and the other military leaders of the Sahel. The US military could not believe that a small country with a military nowhere as strong as the US would have the guts to send them packing. It had never happened before. This is why they decided to twist the narrative about Traore and the military leaders of Niger and Burkina Faso. As you all know, President Traore is generally regarded as the leader of the AES Confederation as a result of his bold stance. While the military leaders of Niger and Mali are also bold, it was President Traore that brought them to the spotlight with his bold and courageous speeches. This is why the US AFRICOM commander specifically mentioned President Traore. The idea is to cast a negative picture about the military leaders of the Sahel and brand them as power-loving leaders whose concern is not for the people but for themselves. This is why the commander described Traore as a leader who is using his country's gold reserves for his own protection. If Burkinabe citizens who are not in the country watch this ridiculous video, they would begin to believe that Traore is just a dictator who does not care for his people. And then, Western media would begin to spread the news all over the internet. Those Burkinabe citizens would probably begin to protest where they are, calling for Traore's evacuation as president. Western media would also carry this news, saying that Burkinabe citizens do not support Traore. When all this happens, what do you think would happen? Of course, the US military would secretly orchestrate a coup, which might lead to Traore's assassination and eventual removal from power. And then, a new military leader with the backing of the US would become the new president of Burkina Faso. In a few months, he would organize an election, which he would win, and everything would go back to the way it was. Additionally, there would be nothing like the new regional bloc, the AES. This was their plan, but fortunately, they failed. And guess what? It wasn't only the US thinking of this. France was also involved. This is not surprising given the fact that France was also humiliated by Traore and the military leaders of the Sahel. A former economic minister of France said something striking once. He said, "If one of the heads of the putschists falls, the others will abandon the vision." Imagine that. President Traore has gone through more assassination and coup attempts than any other leader. Why do you think that is? It's simply because those external forces want to take him out, and they have used the media to propagate their plans. Think about it. Why is it that despite all the things that Traore has done in his country and the fact that he has the support of the people, it's only negative things that are being written about him? There was one time the media began to spread news that Traore had given one of the gold mines in Burkina Faso to Russian mercenaries in exchange for protection. The media twisted this news in such a way that it seemed Traore had committed the biggest crime in the world. Now, even if this news was true, how is it any business of the West? It is normal for the US to go into deals with countries where in exchange for providing security, that country would give the US its resources. This was what the US did in Saudi Arabia. As you know, Saudi Arabia is blessed with oil. So, in order to have access to Saudi's oil, the US decided to offer its military to Saudi Arabia. Not only did the US have access to Saudi's oil, it also got a massive deal in return. Saudi Arabia agreed to seek oil in dollars. This is what is known as the petrodollar agreement. It was this agreement that made the dollar the reserve currency of the world. Nobody has ever faulted the US or Saudi Arabia for making this agreement. But when President Traore of Burkina Faso supposedly did something similar with Russia, it became a crime. How hypocritical of the West. Is it because African countries are poor and do not have a voice? This situation is really pathetic. There are numerous instances where Traore has done a similar thing done by the US, but where this action has been applauded in the US, this same action is condemned by the West in Burkina Faso. Think about when Traore banned some Western media from Burkina Faso. This action was heavily criticized. They called it a dictatorship move and suppression of free speech. But when President Biden did something similar last year by banning RT from the US and Africa, as well as other African media platforms, the West did not blink an eye. The double standard is crazy. Right from time, the West has held Africa to standards not held by themselves. And for this long, African leaders have conformed to the ridiculous system. However, leaders like President Traore are changing the game. Instead of conforming, they are breaking out and creating their own system. How remarkable is that? The US AFRICOM commander has said that Traore is using Burkina Faso's gold reserves for his protection. But as we said earlier, if you have been following Traore, you would know that this is a lie. However, even if this is true, how does it concern the US military? How is it their business? In the US politicians and leaders carry out decisions that they feel are beneficial for the country. Has any African leader ever interfered in America's internal issues? The answer is no. So why can't they stop meddling in African affairs? For so long, the West has meddled in every African issue from economic to politics. They have dictated what economic policies should be implemented through their global financial institutions. They have dictated which leaders should lead African countries. These leaders are usually pro-West. They have dictated what form of governance is the best, which is the so-called democracy. They have interfered in the decisions and policies made by African countries. They have dictated the security of Africa. However, despite these interference, Africa has remained poor and underdeveloped. Not surprising given the fact that that is the aim of the interference in the first place. The African economy, security, and governance has continuously worsened as a result of Western interference. This is why African leaders like Traore and the leaders of the AES are rejecting this interference. They have decided to build countries free from the influence and meddling of the West. And thankfully, the current president of the US is in line with these plans indirectly. You see, Donald Trump doesn't care about Africa. His only concern is America, which should be every leader's concern in the first place. Trump's policy means that he has withdrawn aid, and sources are he is planning on cutting down the US military presence in Africa. For those not aware, the US has used its military presence in Africa to influence the politics and ideologies in the continent. Last year, Tanzania's female president Samia Suluhu Hassan rebuked several Western nations, including the US, for criticizing the country's handling of internal affairs, including murder and kidnapping. "We're not here to be told how to run our country," she said. Without directly naming any embassies, Samia alluded to gun violence in the US, noting that incidents happen in every country, yet Tanzania has never directed its ambassadors to interfere in other nations' internal affairs. Reaffirming her government's commitment to protect and defend the Constitution without external pressure, Samia urged foreign diplomats to not act as technicians guiding Tanzania on its governance. "We have sworn to protect the security of Tanzania and defend the Constitution of Tanzania, and we will do everything possible to enhance the protection and security of Tanzania, because it is our responsibility, and on this responsibility, we need no direction from anyone," she said. However, beyond speaking, it is time for African leaders to take actions like President Traore. The truth is that the only reason the West continues to meddle in African affairs is because African leaders have allowed it. If African leaders stop being greedy and weak and stand for their countries, Western meddling would stop. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.